Did you know that the scariest, most wicked villains in Hollywood history weren't even American? They came from across the ocean with sharp accents, cold eyes, and perfect manners that hid pure evil. By the end of this video, you'll find out which one was the most devilish of them all. 1. Hallowell Hobbs. Let's start small, because not every villain wears a cape. Some of the most dangerous men on screen were the ones standing quietly in the background, and Hallowell Hobbs was exactly that kind of actor. Born in England in 1877, Hobbs spent most of his career playing butlers, advisors, and upper-class gentlemen. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. Hobbs had a talent for playing the man behind the curtain, the trusted lawyer who was actually pulling the strings, the loyal servant who had a secret. He appeared in over 100 films between the 1920s and the 1950s. He didn't need a big moment to be creepy. He just stood there, very still, very proper, and somehow made your skin crawl. 2. Miles Mander. Miles Mander was what people back then called a heavy, the sneaky, untrustworthy guy you just knew was going to do something awful. Born in England in 1888, Mander worked his way through dozens of Hollywood productions, always playing the villain lurking in the background of big studio dramas. He had a thin face, sharp eyes, and the kind of polite smile that made audiences nervous. What made Mander interesting was his range. He could play a scheming aristocrat in one film and a cold-hearted criminal in another. He wasn't the loudest villain in the room. He was the quiet one. And sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. 3. Nigel Bruce. Most people know Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson, the friendly, slightly bumbling companion to Sherlock Holmes, a role he played alongside Basil Rathbone in a long series of films, and he was absolutely lovable in it. But here's the thing. Bruce was a trained British actor who could absolutely turn on the menace when directors needed it. Born in Mexico to British parents in 1895, Bruce had the thick build and commanding presence of someone you wouldn't want to cross. When he played pompous, powerful, or quietly villainous upper-class characters, there was a real edge to it. His casting as Watson was almost a disguise, a charming one. But underneath that warm exterior was an actor fully capable of cold, calculating roles. 4. Alan Napier. Before Alan Napier became everyone's favorite butler, Alfred. In the 1966 Batman TV series, he spent nearly 3 decades terrifying moviegoers. Born in Birmingham, England in 1903, Napier was 6'5" tall. That alone made him unforgettable on screen. Directors couldn't resist casting this towering, aristocratic Englishman as the villain looming in the shadows. One of his standout creepy roles came in the 1944 film Ministry of Fear, where his imposing frame and cold delivery made audiences genuinely uneasy. Napier brought a specific kind of threat, the intelligent, well-dressed kind. Not the monster under the bed, but the monster sitting across from you at the dinner table, speaking in a perfectly calm voice while planning something terrible. If you're enjoying this so far, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. We make videos like this every week. 5. George Zucco. Now we're getting into truly dedicated villain territory. George Zucco was born in Manchester, England in 1886, and by the time Hollywood discovered him, he had refined the art of being sinister to a science. Zucco appeared in dozens of B-movies and horror films throughout the 1930s and 1940s. He was almost always the mastermind, the one running the cult, the one awakening ancient evil, the one who knew too much and wanted too much. He had deep-set eyes, a slow smile, and a voice like cold stone. Even when he was supposed to be a minor character, he somehow took over every scene he was in. Some of his most memorable work came in films with titles like The Mummy's Hand, The Cat and the Canary, and Dead Men Walk. He was never the biggest star on the poster, but he was often the reason people didn't sleep that night. 6. Lionel Atwill. Lionel Atwill brought something special to old Hollywood horror. He made evil look professional. Born in Croydon, England in 1885, Atwill became the go-to actor for mad scientists, corrupt inspectors, and villains hiding behind positions of authority. There was always something deeply unsettling about a bad guy who had power and used it without guilt. His most famous roles include Dr. X from 1932, one of the early sound horror films, and Son of Frankenstein from 1939, where he played the one-armed Inspector Crow, a man who lost his arm to the Frankenstein monster as a child and never, ever forgot it. What made Atwill so effective was his theatrical energy. He was loud when he needed to be, quiet when that was scarier. He understood that being a villain wasn't just about looking evil. It was about behaving in ways that made no moral sense to normal people. He had real theatrical training from London's West End stage, and it showed in every single performance. 7. Cedric Hardwicke, Sir Cedric Hardwicke. Yes, he was knighted, had one of the most deceptively cold screen presences in all of old Hollywood. Born in Worcestershire, England in 1893, Hardwicke trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, one of the most prestigious acting schools in the world. By the time he reached Hollywood, he was already a respected theatrical giant. His thin face, sharp cheekbones, and perfectly controlled diction made him ideal for playing men who believed they were above everyone else. And those kinds of men, calculating, morally indifferent, convinced of their own superiority, are some of the most truly devilish characters ever put on screen. Hardwicke appeared in classics like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Suspicion, and Rope. He brought an icy, intellectual quality to his villains that made them feel completely real, which is somehow far more disturbing than any amount of theatrical overacting. 8. Henry Daniell. Henry Daniell is one of old Hollywood's best-kept secrets, and that is a genuine crime. Born in London in 1894, Daniell became what many film historians now call the most perfectly realized snide villain of the 1940s. Not the loudest, not the most dramatic, but the most precise, the most chilling. He specialized in playing cruel, cold aristocrats, men with absolutely no warmth in their eyes, who treated suffering as an inconvenience to others and a minor curiosity to themselves. In The Philadelphia Story, alongside Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, Daniell played a magazine publisher who was manipulative and fully comfortable with it. In The Seahawk with Errol Flynn, he was the treacherous Lord Wolfingham, an advisor willing to sell out his own country for personal gain. Daniell also appeared alongside Basil Rathbone in multiple Sherlock Holmes films, and the two of them together on screen was like watching two perfectly sharpened blades. What made Daniell extraordinary was his stillness. He never overplayed. He never needed to raise his voice to make the audience fear him. He simply looked at other characters the way a chess player looks at pieces on a board, objects to be moved and discarded. 9. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton was a giant in talent, in reputation, and in the pure fearless commitment he brought to every single role. Born in Scarborough, England in 1899, Laughton won the Academy Award for Best Actor for The Private Life of Henry Fye in 1933. But his most devilish work came in the roles where he leaned fully into darkness. His portrayal of Captain Bligh in Mutiny on the Bounty from 1935 became one of cinema's defining villains. Bligh wasn't a monster in the supernatural sense, he was worse, a real human authority figure who used his power to humiliate, punish, and crush the people beneath him. Laughton played him with relish, making audiences feel genuine anger and disgust. But his masterpiece of devilish work came much later, in 1955, with The Night of the Hunter. In that film, Laughton did not appear. He directed it, and he cast Robert Mitchum as Harry Powell, a serial killer preacher with the words love and hate tattooed on his knuckles. It's considered one of the greatest American films ever made. Laughton only directed one film in his career, and it was that one. The fact that his single directorial effort produced something that dark, that poetic, and that deeply strange tells you everything about what lived inside his creative imagination. 10. George Sanders. George Sanders was almost too good at being terrible. Born in St. Petersburg, Russia, to British parents in 1906, Sanders moved to England and eventually made his way to Hollywood, where he became the undisputed king of the refined, contemptuous cad. He didn't just play villains, he played people who were better than everyone else and wanted the world to know it. His characters were smart, cynical, beautifully dressed, and completely without compassion. And somehow Sanders made that enormously entertaining. In Rebecca from 1940, he played the slick and manipulative Jack Favell, sliding through scenes like oil on water. In All About Eve from 1950, he played the theater critic Addison DeWitt, possibly the most perfectly realized, sophisticated monster in cinema history. That performance won him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Sanders once said in his own memoir that he had played the same kind of villain so many times that it had become difficult to distinguish the actor from the role. He wrote that with no apparent concern whatsoever. He was charming. He was brilliant. He was absolutely not to be trusted. 11. Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff changed horror movies forever. Born William Henry Pratt in Camberwell, London in 1887, Karloff spent years struggling in Hollywood before landing the role that made him immortal, Frankenstein's monster in 1931. What made Karloff's performance so extraordinary and so devilish in the truest sense was his humanity. Under all that makeup, under the flat head and the bolts in the neck, was a being that was genuinely heartbreaking. He was dangerous because he was confused. He was terrifying because he was in some moments deeply sad. Karloff went on to appear in The Mummy, The Black Cat, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, and dozens more. He had an enormous gentle quality off-screen. By all accounts, he was kind, warm, and devoted to children's charities. But on-screen, even when he wasn't playing a monster, there was always something in those deep, dark eyes that made you feel uneasy. Some ancient knowledge, some quiet, patient threat. He is the reason the word creature carries weight in cinema. 12. Claude Rains. Claude Rains had the most extraordinary voice in old Hollywood. Full stop. Born in Clapham, London in 1889, Rains grew up with a severe stutter, which he worked for years to overcome through acting training. By the time he reached Hollywood, his voice was one of the most distinctive instruments in the entire film industry. Layered, musical, capable of immense warmth and absolute menace, sometimes in the same sentence. His debut film was The Invisible Man in 1933. And here's the remarkable thing about that performance. Rains was literally invisible for most of it. You only heard his voice, and that was enough. His portrayal of Dr. Jack Griffin, a scientist driven mad by his own experiment, is completely compelling through sound alone. Then came Casablanca in 1942, arguably the greatest American film ever made. Rains played Captain Louis Renault, a French police officer who is corrupt, self-serving, morally flexible, and completely aware of all of it. Somehow Rains made this man one of the most beloved characters in the film. His final scene with Humphrey Bogart is pure cinematic magic. Rains received 4 Academy Award nominations without ever winning. That's one of Hollywood's most shameful oversights. He played heroes, villains, and everything in between with equal brilliance. But there was always something underneath every performance. A layer of private knowledge, of dangerous intelligence that made even his most sympathetic characters feel like they were hiding something. 13. Peter Cushing. Peter Cushing was one of the kindest, most gentle men who ever walked through a Hollywood studio. Everyone who met him said so. He loved bird watching, he adored his wife, he was endlessly polite, and on screen he was absolutely terrifying. Born in Kenley, Surrey, England in 1913, Cushing found his greatest fame through the British studio Hammer Horror in the late 1950s. Alongside Christopher Lee, he appeared in a long series of gothic horror films that redefined the genre with color, atmosphere, and genuine acting quality. Cushing's speciality was not the monster. That was Lee's territory. Cushing played the scientist, the expert, the man who understood exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. As Victor Frankenstein in Hammer's series, he played the Doctor as truly cold, not a tragic figure, but a man driven by pure intellectual obsession, willing to use human bodies as raw material without a flicker of remorse. It was a genuinely disturbing performance. Then came Star Wars in 1977, where a whole new generation met him as Grand Moff Tarkin, the Imperial officer who ordered the destruction of an entire planet, Princess Leia's home, without so much as raising his voice. He stood on the Death Star's bridge with his hands clasped behind his back and his chin slightly raised, and he made you believe absolutely that this gentle birdwatcher from Surrey could end worlds. That contrast between who he was and what he played is what made Peter Cushing truly remarkable. 14. Sir Christopher Lee. There has never been anyone quite like Christopher Lee. Born in Belgravia, London in 1922, Lee served in the Royal Air Force during World War II before turning to acting. He was 6'5" tall, with a voice described by directors as a cathedral organ played softly. He spoke 5 languages fluently. He was a trained classical musician. He had met J.R.R. Tolkien personally, which is why he was so devastated whenever Peter Jackson didn't cast him as Gandalf. He played Dracula for Hammer Horror 9 times, beginning with Dracula in 1958. His portrayal was completely different from any previous version, where Bela Lugosi's Dracula had been theatrical and elegant. Lee's was physical, animalistic, and overwhelming. He was a predator, not a charmer. When he appeared on screen, the temperature seemed to drop. But Lee was never just a horror star. He played the villain Francisco Scaramanga in the James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun. He played Saruman in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, bringing genuine intellectual menace to the corrupted wizard. He played Count Dooku in the Star Wars prequel films. Late in life, he even recorded a heavy metal album at the age of 90 because Christopher Lee simply did not recognize limitations. He was knighted in 2009. He received the BAFTA Fellowship. He holds the Guinness World Record for most film acting roles ever credited to a single performer, with over 250 films. When he died in 2015 at the age of 93, the world lost the last true titan of Gothic cinema. There will not be another one. 15. Basil Rathbone. And here we are, the most devilish of them all. Basil Rathbone was born in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1892 to British parents, and he became the gold standard for screen villains so completely that Hollywood kept casting him as the bad guy, even when he desperately wanted to play something else. He was a decorated World War I veteran, a trained classical actor, and a gifted fencer, one of the best sword fighters in Hollywood history. Those dueling skills made his action scenes with Errol Flynn in The Adventures of Robin Hood and The Mark of Zorro among the most thrilling ever filmed. As Sir Guy of Gisborne in Robin Hood, Rathbone was magnetic, dark-eyed, impeccably dressed, sneering at Flynn's heroic buffoonery with absolute contempt. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to humiliate. That quality, the enjoyment of superiority, is what made him so genuinely chilling. Then Sherlock Holmes came along, and everything changed. Beginning with The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1939, Rathbone played Holmes in 14 films and hundreds of radio broadcasts. His sharp, angular face, his surgical precision of speech, his almost inhuman intelligence, all of it was perfect for the great detective. But here's the strange thing. Playing the hero, Sherlock Holmes, trapped him. Audiences loved him in that role so completely that they no longer wanted to see him as a villain. He spent the later part of his career fighting to be cast in different roles, largely without success. The man who was Hollywood's greatest villain became its greatest detective, and never quite got free of either. Basil Rathbone was the sharpest blade in old Hollywood's entire collection. And the most devilish thing about him was that you never quite knew which side of the sword you were standing on. 15 British actors. Each one brought something specific, something sharp, something unforgettable to Hollywood's most wicked roles. Which one was your favorite? Drop their name in the comments right now. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe. We got more deep dives into cinema's greatest legends coming every week.